There's also the Q&A format on the bottom of your screen or your toolbar that is an excellent way to ask questions for me today throughout the talk. I will do my best to try to get to all of them, though with the amount of you who are logged in, it may not be the case that I can answer them all. Some of them I'll just integrate into the flow of the day. Before we get started, a little bit about me and introduce myself to you. And I want to share where I'm at with my state of emotions as well. And I think it would be amiss to not have on our minds what's unfolding in our country around us. So I'm an OT. I have worked in the schools as well as the private setting. It's the passion of my work in the schools, seeing so many kids struggle with regulation and have so many punitive measures brought upon them because of their lack of regulation. That has led me to create the zones of regulation and passions me to share this with you. And so with that, I'm also a resident of the city of Minneapolis. I live about 20 blocks, less than 20 blocks from where George Floyd was murdered. So it has been a very challenging week for myself, for my family, for my community. I am going to ask for your grace and understanding today as I work to regulate through all these feelings that we've had. Things haven't gone exactly as planned. So there's layers of heartbreak in my soul, in my heart, in our community. And I have moved through the emotions of sad to angry to unrest to uneasiness, and most recently, a lot of fear. And we made the decision to leave the city over the weekend when the unrest continued to unfold and the looting and fires moved closer into our neighborhoods. So I am in northern Wisconsin. We are hoping the internet will continue to work fluidly, but if it doesn't, please just understand we will log back on as soon as we can. And I understand, I acknowledge my privilege of being able to leave, my privilege of class, and that my suffering is only temporary compared to those in our communities who are of color and who constantly live in the state of fear. And I really think it's important that as we go into this conversation we're going to have today, we know our work can start right in the schools. It can start in our communities. It can start with how we're treating the people that are around us and partnering with them, understanding, empathizing with them, and teaming with them to build skills and capacity to be able to manage emotions rather than take punitive, violent approaches in how we try to get coherence out of the individuals we're serving. So thank you, and let's keep that in mind as we dive into this today and how our impact can start even with how we are approaching the people we serve. So, okay, I gotta regulate. This is a little more housekeeping things. And I also too, I don't share that for your empathy, for your sympathy, but I just do want to be transparent and where my mind is at, where my heart is at, and some of the emotions that I'm working through real time today. So I've included my disclosures for you. They're there. And I've also included where you can find us on the web. These are social media outlets that we try to push out information on. If you look at Facebook, there is the Zones of Regulation and Action. That's a Facebook group that you can request to join. If you agree to the rules, we'll let you in, and you can access this community of over 30,000 people from around the world who are just interested in talking about the zones and sharing experiences, supporting each other. So, for example, if you have a question and potentially I don't get to it today, it would be an excellent place to pose your question, and you will be getting feedback then from more people than just myself to help guide you. There's also some files uploaded up in that, so you can access some of the information we're talking about today. If you also look through the chat feed, Molly is my sister. She's also a resident of Minneapolis and left with her family too. So she is going to be sending you, she also is my operations of my business director, I guess. She's live through this. She will be giving you links on the chat of websites I mentioned, things, resources. She also is your tech support today. So if you have a real-time question, let her know. She has provided you email and phone, and you can call or text her, and she'll help get you set. So I am also want to direct you to our website here. We have a lot of information on there, and it is for you to direct people. If you want to give them just a little bit of information about the zones, you can start there. We have our links to products and articles. We have interviews we've done, and then a lot of free resources, including we have a whole page set up for distant learning right now. We have a whole page set up for school-wide implementation of the zone, so make sure you check that out too. Are the links going to be emailed to us? What is in the back of your handouts is most of the links I'm talking about are back there in your handouts, as well as integrated throughout the PowerPoint. So I am going to follow up with Molly to see if we can email this as well. She will let you know, but there is most of the stuff is cited in that. She's just bringing attention to it in the chat as well. So big picture, we are going to think about understanding self-regulation. And I liken this to, I wouldn't go and start teaching literacy without a background in literacy. So I want to go over essentially the foundation of what this is in a brief overview this morning. And for many of you, you may know this information. If that's the case, I really encourage you just to listen for some sound bites and take home messages, because I know you go back to teams, and we need to be advocates for our students, for the people we serve. We need to educate those who don't understand this and just see it as a behavior problem. So we'll be spending this early morning, and I recognize some of you are tuning in from the other side of the world, and Singapore and Australia and the UK. So thank you for being with us and hanging on throughout your night. But we'll be talking about that piece this morning as we get started. And then after our mid-morning break, which will be coming to at 10:15 Central Time, so an hour and 45 minutes into this talk, then we'll be moving into the zones and thinking about how this looks, what we can, is that right? Sorry, my time, my math. I am super sleep deprived too, so I'm just trying my best here, so please bear with me. And we'll go into our framework of the zones, look at lessons, adaptations, expansions. We're gonna After the afternoon break, we're going to look at exploring tools and uh, be thinking about ways we can integrate this exploration of tools into our practice and end with considerations around implementation and settings. And with that, the other thing I want to say as housekeeping is this is all about regulations. So we have breaks built in. The schedule agenda was emailed to you. We are going to ask you, though, please do what you need throughout the day to regulate. You might need to stand up and stretch or doodle or refill your coffee or whatever it might be. So be thinking about that and really practicing what we're preaching. So thinking about what is self-regulation, is our ability to adjust our levels of alertness. And when we're thinking about levels of alertness, how many of you, if you want to show on your hands, raise your hands, hit snooze this morning when your alarm went off? So that's this lower level of alertness. Physiologically, our body is low in energy. Our heartbeat is slowed down. Our muscles are loose and relaxed. And that's in stark contrast to how many of you were jolted awake when that alarm clock went off? That's where I was. I felt my heart pound and beat out of my chest. My eyes pop open, dilated, looking for what is that noise? Is there danger around me? And I feel this surge of energy come through me. And then there is those of us who were already awake when that alarm clock went off, maybe planning their day, getting themselves organized, thinking about what that schedule might look like for them today. And that's a more grounded, organized state of alertness, or we also call this levels of arousal. So this naturally is going to fluctuate throughout the day. And when we're talking, sorry, I didn't finish this. When we're thinking about regulation, it's this levels of alertness, but then we also think about these emotions we feel. And we're human, we feel. And so we're not in the business of telling people how they should or should not feel. Rather, we're working to help figure out how do we reveal this emotion? How is it expressed in a way that's adaptive to the social context, the environment that we're in? We think about the task demands being asked of us, the goals that we're trying to achieve, whether that's short term. I just want to get through this work so I have some time to play, to long term, I want to get good grades and get on to a good university. We're integrating that goal-minded mindset into our regulation as we're aging up as well. So when we think about what this regulation encompasses, it's so much more than anger and frustration. We think about the anxiety that we work to manage. And that's such a tricky emotion. It's so easily disguised as anger, as shutting down, as maybe defiance. And you peel back the layers, and beneath it is an anxious individual. We work to regulate sadness, attention, and focus. Think about all those kids you know who are in an excitatory state, but they often have a hard time kind of down regulating to maybe more classroom learning mode. So we work to regulate these fun, positive emotions like excitement, silliness, our sensory needs, stress as we're aging up continues to mount, and so much more. So we need to be understanding that this is a roller coaster ride of emotions. And sometimes we're way up and sometimes we're way down. And for some of those individuals that we're serving, they may be on a much wilder ride than those around them. We know that this regulation ability is impacted by neurotransmitter activity in the brain, these connections, the communication between the different parts of our brain. And there's an underlying neurobiological underpinning for many of these individuals that these connections just aren't made, or their hormone levels are off. The neurotransmitters aren't operating at the speed that we need to have these pathways. We know sensory events can impact us. that if suddenly there's a loud bang in your environment, an auditory stimuli, we physiologically probably will have a heart that starts pounding a little bit more. Our eyes are vigilant. Our muscles are ready to flee or fight. And we certainly need to acknowledge that a history of trauma and adverse experiences are impacting this as well. And I think, right now, in the age of COVID-19 and now riots across our cities, we especially need to be acknowledging the trauma that our children are going through, our youth, that this is very hard for them. This is very challenging to make sense of. So we will talk a little bit more about this as well. That's something that I am seeing just widespread through so much of our youth right now as they're impacted by the events unfolding around them. So when we talk about a lack of regulation, I may refer to it as dysregulation behavior. When I mention that, I'm just talking about human output. It's our actions that can be both positive and negative. And so often behavior gets this negative association with it. But right now I'm just speaking, I'm gesturing to you. My behavior is very neutral. And then we're going to talk about co-regulation. And co-regulation occurs in the context of a social interaction. So you think about a baby being born, the first moments of life, they are scooped up by a caregiver and held and comforted and co-regulated. This is a student frustrated with their work and raising their hand to get help. This is you at the end of a day where there might have been a lot of stressors, finding a colleague to go vent to or calling your partner on your way home to process and blow off some steam. So we're heavily dependent on co-regulators in those earlier stages of development. But even as adults, we still rely on co-regulation to help us manage. And we just also build a capacity to self-regulate as we age up and mature. So a little research on regulation, that this first study is so powerful, I feel. They looked at incoming kindergartners and they pre-tested their reading abilities, their math abilities, and their regulation abilities using a battery of tests to get a quotient score for it, as well as then their IQ. And they sent these these pre-kindergartners through that kindergarten year, and they post-measured academic success. The best predictor of academic success was not a high IQ, not the best regulation abilities made the most academic gains later in that school year. And so I feel this is so imperative that we must be able to reach them before we're able to teach them. We need to have this foundational skill intact if they're going to take any of that information we're delivering in their academic setting and turning it into knowledge. So as we look at regulation, I think it's important to see the developmental lens of this skill. This is developmental, just like learning to walk and learning to talk. And therefore, some of our students may have a chronological age of, say, 15 years old, but their developmental age might be more on par with what we're seeing of a 5-year-old. And so this development is not dependent on their language abilities, their IQ. Some of our kids are very bright, very verbal, yet their regulation is quite delayed. So the initial behavior strategies phase is the behavior strategies. In this phase, it's predominant the first year of life. And we are heavily dependent on a co-regulator during that time. Uh, they those co-regulators use a lot of sensory motor strategies to try to soothe the baby. And how do you know the baby needs soothing? How do you know they're dysregulated? Well, it's their behavior. This is the behavior strategy space. So they're fussing, they're swatting things away, they're wailing to let you know they're upset. And so, if you want to use that chat right now, we can be thinking about the different senses. Think about auditory. How do you soothe the baby through the auditory sense? Think about movement, vestibular. How do you soothe the baby? Visual. So, you guys can throw in a bunch of ideas if you want. And touch. Think about tactile. So, I got a question. Can you cite the information? Yeah, I've included the research articles that you can go to if you want to dig deeper in that. There's also a lot of information. The Illinois Department of Education has a really robust website specifically around regulation, social emotional learning. And they have a lot of great resources in there as well. If you're looking for more research, CASEL can direct you to a lot of information as well. So as we continue to develop, typically around the first birthday, we start seeing the emergence of some language strategies. This is words, symbols used to help us regulate. So I remember thinking about my daughter, and I have, on a side note, my daughter is 7 and my son turns 10 this week. So I have 2 elementary age kids. And when my daughter was about 1, she started going, bah, bah, and she would use a point so as a gesture, and the word approximation, bah, for bottle, to let us know she was hungry. She wanted that bottle. And then we could get that need met and co-regulate with her without having to hear her wail. And then we're guessing, are you hungry? Are you tired? Do you have a dirty diaper? So the other thing, as these kids are beginning to use more words, more language, more gestures, is that this can also mean kids with augmentative communication devices are expressing themselves. Think about kids with textbooks using sign language. These are all expressions of language strategies too. What we would typically see is by about 3 years of age, these young guys are able to express the basic emotion words. I'm sad, I'm tired, I'm happy. To caregivers, I think about my daughter. She came up to me. She was maybe about 1.5 years. She goes, Mama, I need a hug. And then I could scoop her up and give her that comfort she's looking for. They're certainly negotiating their concerns, and that's a piece of this too. They're figuring out that they are their own entity, that they have their own wants, needs, desires, and testing those limits and boundaries. That's going to help them move towards the more metacognitive stage. So that metacognitive strategy stage, we really pick up this internal dialogue. And in the beginning, it's very much what's been modeled to us. So, for example, our friends came over with their son who was preschool age, and this typically starts developing, emerging in those preschool years. And to be mindful, this is still the stage we're in as adults. And so we are continuing to still work on regulation even as adults. There is no, Leah's able to self-regulate with 100% accuracy across 5 environments with 3 different stressors and no prompting with 5 out of 5 opportunities. Let me tell you, I do not meet that goal. I still need co-regulation, and I don't always regulate myself as effectively as I would like to. I have my shutdowns, my meltdowns, my tears, my anxiety overwhelms me. So there is really a lifelong development to this. There's no mastery of this. So back to the story that our friends came over with their little boy, and he was really frightened of our dog. And every time my dog kind of strolled through the room, he would get upset and run to mom and dad. And I would hear them say, Joseph, it's okay. She's a friendly girl. And this happened a number of times. And then at one point, he's playing with my son on the floor. And here comes my dog. And he looks up with those big eyes, but he doesn't see mom and dad. And I hear him say out loud, Joseph, it's okay. She's a friendly girl. And in that moment, he used that internal dialogue to help him manage the situation. And he was able to meet his goal, which was to continue to play trucks on the floor with my son rather than run off and need to be co-regulated by mom and dad. And so as we're developing more of these metacognitive skills, this prefrontal cortex, these executive functions start helping us. We're better able to organize our thoughts. We're able to problem solve. We can regulate our attention, let ourselves know, I just have to stay focused 5 more minutes and then it's recess. Let's just try to get this done. So we're more reflective on the what it takes to help us regulate and manage and tapping into that prefrontal cortex to help us. We also bring in perspective taking, social conventions, understanding what the norms are so that we can be matching our behavior, that expression of these emotions to the context around us. And so that's something that as we age up, it certainly becomes a bigger factor. You think about what's the ramifications of having a meltdown as a 4-year-old in front of your peers. Pretty minimal, right? As a 14-year-old in front of your peers, it's getting pretty dicey. But if you're 40 and melting down in front of your peers, it is highly likely that relationships are being impaired, work might be, employment might be severed. So this is something that as we age up, we're certainly becoming more influenced by is the social lens. And so, of course, the support and guidance from caregivers is instrumental. When we have healthy modeling going on in the home, when we have parents, caregivers helping to co-regulate, providing secure attachments, using language to identify the different feelings that the child might be experiencing, setting limits and expectations, that is going to help this child develop these skills. However, I have worked with many, many, many kids over the years, and I can say with certainty, many of them come from homes where caregivers are doing everything and beyond to support the acquisition of these skills and provide a healthy home and model this and provide that stability, yet their child is developmentally behind where their peers are at in the skill set. And so we just need to keep that lens on that there is these neurobiological underpinnings, that this is a skill that some of us are developmentally lagging in when compared to their peers. We also can think about kids who've experienced ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. We need to have our trauma lens on too. And ACEs are as common as parents getting divorced, the death of a close loved one, living in high poverty, homeless, high mobility, to incarceration of caregivers, abuse of any kind, neglect, and the witnessing of traumatic events in their life. And so what we know is these stressors, these ACEs, when they're compounded upon each other in those childhood years, there is lifelong implications for these individuals that there's disrupted neurodevelopment found. Social, emotional, and cognitive impairments are more likely to show up in individuals who have more ACEs. So truly that brain starts getting wired differently. They have a higher likelihood of adopting health risk behaviors as they age up. Disease, disability, and social problems are more prevalent in adulthood, and there's even a correlation with an earlier death rate. And so we need to be trauma informed, and we need to recognize that these kids who come to us with these ACEs, that they need to be treated, they need to be supported in the same way a kid who maybe has a developmental disability label, that we have the understanding that there is lagging development in this area. That same lens needs to be used for kids who have experienced trauma, and we need to team with them. We need to be patient. We need to work to build the skill set for them. So what I want you to do right now is a reflection. So think about a student, individual on your caseload in your classroom, and let's use a developmental lens to look at where they're functioning at. So for example, I've worked over the years with one of my neighbors. He has an autism spectrum disorder and an anxiety disorder. And one of his goals when he got into high school was to start riding the van, this provided transportation to school. And when that van came to pick him up, he bolted down the sidewalk. He used a behavior strategy to manage that stressor. The next year, we try again. He blockaded himself in front of the door and refused to get on the van. Again, he was using a behavior strategy. So then following year, his sophomore year or junior year, the van comes and he stepped into the van and he turned to his mom and he said, "I am so pissed at you right now. I hate you." And she said, "Joey, I'm so proud of you. You can do this. I'm going to follow the van." And she co-regulated with him and he started riding the van. And he used some language strategies to express where he was at and feeling. And albeit it's not the language mom wants, it was a lot more functional than running down the street or blockading himself in front of the door. Now, Joey just graduated from the transition programming. I see him walk out to the van independently, and I would bet that he's using some of the metacognitive strategies, thinking this is just how I got to get to school. I will be done with this in 15 minutes. I get to see my friends once I get to the work site or whatever. That kind of self-talk dialogue might be to help him manage through that. So let's reframe the lens in which we see these kids and think about it from a developmental lens. I will give you a couple minutes just to think about your caseload, the students that you're interacting with, and where they may be falling on this developmental process. As we think about this too, there is no just clear, like we turn the page and we move from behavior strategies to language strategies. If you think about us as we function as adults, there is many times in our life we revert to language strategies. When we're faced with stressors, you think about how commonly like the 4-letter words come out when we get upset, as an example. And unfortunately, there's times we resort to behavior strategies potentially when we get stressed. So there is no just unilateral progression through this. But as we're building capacity, hopefully we are building more metacognitive strategies that we can be thinking about how to best manage ourselves in the situation that we're in more healthy, adaptive, pro-social ways. And, you also think about, what's the factors going on around this environment that we're in. I have heard my husband say to my kids as he's grown short in his temper, quickly apologize and say, I'm just really stressed right now. There's so much going on, and recognizing, this pressure we have on us right now, the reality of what we're trying to live through, certainly comes factoring in, and how much we can take of this without not being able to always manage it as successfully as we want. Okay. We're going to look into some of the components of regulation. I see these as some of these pillars to being able to regulate. And you take away abilities in any one of these areas, and it is likely also going to then transfer into the regulatory abilities. So as an OT, I was trained to really understand the sensory processing system. And working in the schools, that was something that I focused on supporting in my caseload. So a common scenario would be I would show up to a classroom and the teacher would push a student literally out the door and say, he needs to calm down. So I would bring that student to my sensory motor area I had set up in the school. I would help him with modulating these senses and getting him into this just right state, and come back to the room. And the teacher says something to the effect of, well, we're on problem 7 now, and so I need you to catch up. And the student's now having this emotional reaction. And the teacher's looking at me thinking like, well, now what are you going to do? And I'm looking at the teacher like, I just did my stuff. What are you going to do? And I realized there's a lot of us adults standing around looking at each other and not sure what to do. And if the student didn't quickly start complying, then the walkie-talkies are coming out. We need backup to room 116. And if that kid didn't quickly comply, then they're now having restraint, seclusion. We had locked seclusion at our school, timeout. We have suspensions, expulsions. And, this is what I was saying this morning too. This is disproportionately happening to our students of color. And so we can be impacting the way that these students are treated and be really thinking about how it is that we're approaching our different students and helping them rather than continuing to hurt them. So as I was looking at this and not able to feel that we were doing our best job, I saw that there were so many more skills needed than just these sensory processing strategies, techniques. And this was about 15 years ago now. And so I started hearing about this term executive functioning. And I knew I didn't know enough to have the insight of what to do. So I just really started to try to take more courses, read more books, and learn about some of these other skills that may be impacting their ability to do something more adaptive, more functional when faced with stressors. And so we're going to touch on these executive functioning skills. Emotional regulation was certainly apparent, but no one was teaching them these social emotional skills to do something more adaptive. The social cognitive skills too were a need. And it wasn't just the kids on the autism spectrum who were lagging in these social cognitive skills. This one boy who was identified as an emotional behavior disorder student who had friends and was streetwise, but one day he threw this chair across the classroom, and excuse me, my voice is hoarse. I'm processing it with him later, and he told me very sincerely that nobody noticed. Like, everybody noticed. We don't miss a chair flying across the room. How do you think the other kids felt? Like, I don't know. And I'm like, that felt scary. They felt insecurity being in the room with you. And he struggled to see why that might be impacting why he sat alone at lunch that day and no one joined him. And so it's so important too that we're helping to build this social cognitive understanding too for these kids and how this plays into how we regulate. And know that this is so complex that there needs to be a tremendous amount of orchestration between these different skills and the areas of the brain for the smooth adaptive behavior, this regulated person to be present. And that there is many of our students who lag in one or more of these areas. And we see then the dysregulation more prominent. So we're going to start with the sensory processing piece. And this is a short little video clip to introduce this topic.
Some kids are really bouncy and can't sit still. Some kids aren't very coordinated. Some see food as a pile of toxic goo that hurts their mouth and jangles their taste buds. School might be a mysterious place where things don't make much sense. If this sounds like you, you may have sensory processing disorder, and we're going to explain it here. Your body has 7 senses: vision in your eyes, hearing in your ears, touch in your skin, taste in your mouth, and smell in your nose. And you have 2 movement senses: your muscles and your sense of balance. In sensory processing disorder, these senses don't communicate right with your brain. Think of the nerves connecting your brain and senses as a set of roads. Those roads should be smooth superhighways so that the senses and brain can communicate fast. If you have sensory processing disorder, then some of your roads are bumpy and rough. You can also think of the senses as having a broken volume control. Ow! If the volume is too high, you will feel your senses too strongly. If the volume is too low, you won't feel sensation at all. In fact, you'll want more. Some kids overcome these problems as they grow older. Others need help. Help is usually occupational therapy, and it's fun. Occupational therapy helps build up the connections between your senses and your brain. The more you do, the stronger and smoother they get, kind of like paving those roads.
Okay, so This video touched on some of these hidden senses. That vestibular sense is located in our inner ear canal, and it helps us with our body's relationship to gravity. So maybe you've had this sensation of putting your head down and coming up too fast and feeling a little dizzy, disoriented. That's your vestibular sense righting itself. We have our proprioceptive sense located in joints, ligaments, muscles. This helps us know where our body is in space, so that if we have to kind of snake out of a smaller area, we can do so without bumping the table over, knocking the drinks off the table. You know how much room you have to maneuver before we bump into the neighbor next to us. So this proprioceptive sense also helps us with our gradation of force. So if my cup is nearly empty, I'm going to need less force than if it's nearly full. And if I'm expecting it to be full and I pick up my neighbor's and it's nearly empty, I might use too much force and it comes splashing the coffee up in my face. This helps us with our finesse. Then the interoceptive system was not touched on, but this is a sense that is getting a lot of attention in the last couple of years. This is our sense that's located in our internal organs, our body, that helps us know what's going on inside of our body and sharing that information with the brain. So it's communicating things like heat, thirst, hunger, but also it's the root of these emotions. So how do we know what we're feeling? Our bodies let us know. You know you have this like frog in your throat and you might be about to cry and you're getting overwhelmed with sadness. Maybe you have this pit in your stomach, this brick on your chest, and you're feeling anxious. For me, I keep feeling my heart pounding, and I keep saying to my husband, like, my heart doesn't stop pounding. That is this anxiety that's been expressing itself, or how it's been manifesting in me. So we are going to talk more about this interoceptive sense this afternoon, and think about how we can be building more skills in this area as well. I want to also explain with each sense, and just to preface this too, this is such a brief overview of what is a very complex topic. Sensory integration and modulation could be a 2-week seminar just on itself. So just to give a brief overview, our senses have a just right threshold. What is amount of this stimuli that I'm comfortable with, that I feel satiated and organized around? And sometimes that sense is set very high, and we call this hypo-responsive. So these individuals seek additional sensory stimuli in that sense. For example, our vestibular seekers need a lot more movement than their peers. So these are the kids constantly on a go, driven by a motor. They're tipping their head upside down, spinning themselves around, maybe up moving around when you want them in their desk. They're running and skipping down the hall when you're asking them to form a nice line and walk. So these kids are driven to try to get more of this movement so that then they feel more organized. Their nervous system is regulated through this movement. We see proprioceptive seekers. These kids are looking for every jump, thump, bump, kind of crash or jolt to their body, because that helps them know where their body is in space. So for example, this kid may look like in your classroom a student who comes up every morning and wants to wrestle around and give you a giant bear hug. These kids may be literally falling out of their desks or crashing their bodies into the lockers in the hallway. They are rolling around during circle time, launching themselves off of furniture, hanging from fixtures, climbing unsafely potentially. This one 5th grader I was working with, I asked him how his day was, and he goes, "It was awesome, Miss Leah." And I said, "Oh, why so?" He goes, "I didn't send anyone to the nurse today." I said, "Do you typically?" And he goes, "Yeah, usually someone gets hurt by me every day playing flag football." And I go out to watch him at recess, and he is like this bowling ball, just barreling into these other kids. And that feels good for him. He also doesn't have the finesse just to swipe that flag like his peers do. Uh, in the classroom, this kid took up an enormous amount of space because he has so little information about where his body is. So there's no desk in his perimeter because he lacked that awareness. So we can see tactile seekers. These kids are touching your hair, touching your skin, anything you put on their table, their hands are in, they drag their hands along the wall. We see visual seekers, taste seekers, smell seekers. And then on the other extreme, sometimes our sense is set very low. And you might have one sense set high, one sense set low. But when our senses are set low, it causes us to be hyper responsive. So that means we are easily overwhelmed. We may feel defensive to this sensory stimuli and potentially avoid it. So you think about many of our kids who cover their ears, they don't tolerate noise that they're not making. We see kids who, when you touch them, they react in an aggressive posture because to them that felt like lightning bolts shocking their system. It wasn't a gentle touch to remind them to do something or to congratulate them. We see kids who are vestibular avoiders maybe hesitate to go onto the grassy lawn because underneath that grass is a whole bunch of little bumps in the ground that they can't see and have to navigate over. In climates where there's a lot of snow and ice, that can be very challenging for someone who's hyper responsive to vestibular input. So we think about how we can be setting up a sensational life. And this is the work of Dr. Lucy Jane Miller, who is an OT and has put her life's work into providing more education and research around sensory processing disorder. And so I like the way Lucy frames this, that we can be setting up this sensational life where we are proactively and meaningfully giving them sensory inputs embedded into their daily routines so that they can better be able to maintain a more regulated state. Versus, I think about that example I gave you earlier of what I have done in the past is I show up at a prescribed hour and it might be too late to pick up this kid and bring him to the sensory motor room. The teacher is already shoving him out the door because his sensory needs mounted, and now he's finding disruptive, more maladaptive ways to get his sensory needs met. And we're being reactive in that setting. So I've really shifted my framework and how I approach this. And the more we can front load them and embed into their daily routines ways to get these sensory supports met with everyday activity and with supports embedded into their structured days so that they have access to help keep their body feeling in a more grounded, regulated state. And know that this, for students who fall on the extremes of these, you may need to be accessing an OT to help guide you. OTs are trained in this and they can be working in collaboration with you to further individualize what these sensory supports may look like. When we get into tools later today, we are going to be thinking about how we can use our zones tools to support that sensory system as well. So turning our attention to modulation. Modulation is being able to stay attuned to the relevant sensory stimuli. For example, in the classroom, it's the teacher in the front of the room. It's the visuals that he or she's referencing, the auditory information they're providing. And then we have our visual materials at our desk. And then we have all the successive additional sensory stimuli that we are working to filter out. So we have the heating system or cooling system blowing air and making noise. We have all this artwork dangling from the ceiling. We have some kids playing outside the window at recess. We got an itchy tag in the back of our shirt today. That boy wore that windsuit, and every time he moves, there's this rustling noise, and lockers are slamming in the hallway, and every time I'm just jolted by that noise. And to top it off, we have the smell of fish sticks wafting from the cafeteria that is just gagging us. For some individuals, that is enough to set them into a much more fragile state. That nervous system isn't organized. And so they may easily be moving into a flight, fright response. And what happens to that sensory stimuli that we're trying to get them to pay attention to? It got lost in the mix. It is taking a tremendous amount of energy for these individuals. It's exhausting for them to be constantly filtering all this, something that most of us do pretty effortlessly. For other individuals who struggle to modulate and filter out the relevant from the irrelevant stimuli, it is for them exhausting, and they shut down to cope. And so you think about bringing a baby to, say, high school basketball game. What do infants often do in that environment? They fall asleep, even though it's not on their nap schedule, because that sensory system, nervous system, is wired to shut down when we're overwhelmed by stimuli. And so we may have kids in our classrooms who are getting labeled as lazy or, unmotivated, and it may be their nervous system's way of coping with this kind of bombardment of sensory information around them. So I have seen in the chat, you guys want the link to the sensory processing video, and I know I didn't include it in your handouts. So what I am going to do is I will put it up in a moment, and you can, we'll give that to you. Well, I also am going to ask you to do this. In your handouts, you have a full page printout that you were able to access of the sensory preferences and lifestyles. What I want you to do is a self-reflection or student reflection. Where do you fall on the scale of avoiding, neutral to seeking in the different senses? And then think about what have you integrated into your lifestyle, into your daily routines to help get your sensory needs met. So I'm more of a vestibular and proprioceptive seeker. I find that I need movement. I really am in a much more regulated state when I exercise regularly. I love doing physical activities with my kids, but visually and auditorily, as I get older, I keep moving over to the avoiding side of the scale. I don't enjoy chaotic environments like parades, fairs. Thinking about going into loud bars and restaurants with live music is just not my cup of tea anymore. And so we make choices based upon these sensory preferences. Maybe think about your desk, your home, and visually, is it cluttered? Do you like a lot of art on the wall? Or maybe it's very minimal and organized. Your sensory preferences play into that. So what I want you to do is take a couple minutes here to do a self or student reflection, and I will bring up that video as well so you can see where that link is. Okay, so it's on here right now, the title and the YouTube link. Okay, the link is in your chat, and I'm just going through a couple of the questions right now that we have had come in. So, do we always use the strategies in order of development when learning to regulate in a new circumstance? Behavior, language, metacognition. That is the typical order of development. And if you're interested in reading a lot more about that, there I've included in the link Claire Kopp's information as a resource, a reference in the back of your handouts. It's one of the articles listed. There is also the CERTS model, which is listed in there. Greenspan's work can give you a lot more in-depth information around the development of regulation. There is someone chimed in about their 8-year-old son with ADHD and how he's currently at the behavior language strategy stage and seeing the language break down when he's angry, turning to hitting and screaming. And I can relate to that. I also want to share that I have a son who has PANS Pandas, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, I've included that link in the back of your handouts too on the website. The Pandas Awareness Network is a great place to learn and something we all really should be aware of because it is impacting many of our students out there. But so my son was typical in development and really showing a lot of emerging metacognitive strategies as a 5-year-old, and then got sick. And his development reverted right back to that behavior strategies phase where we were seeing a lot of hitting, screaming, huge meltdowns. And now he is 10, and we're really starting to see a big maturity. I'm hearing words now. I'm overwhelmed. This is frustrating. And so those language strategies are becoming really predominant now. And sometimes even his own self-regulation, more metacognitive tools are being accessed. And he's saying, I'm going to be taking a break. I'm using a tool right now and really showing some emergence into the metacognitive strategies. So it's not necessarily always a linear progression as we move through these developmental stages too. Molly just put in the chat that some of you are only chatting to the panelists, and you want to make sure to click, you want to chat with the panelists and attendees if your information is intended to be seen by more than just Molly and I. The interoceptive aspect of hyper and hypo type feelings, that is something that is not as clear as with the other senses that we were talking about. And we're going to talk about where you can dig in deeper for interoceptive work later. So there's more information to come on that too. And if you're looking at, I'm thinking this question here about where to purchase the book is around Lucy Jane Miller's book. I would just potentially go to her website and see if there's links to purchasing, and if you can buy through the author, that would probably be the best place to start. Otherwise, I know it's available on Amazon too. And is there student-friendly surveys for sensory preferences? There's a lot of resources on the web for that. This is something that if you're really digging in though, we have standardized evaluations that OTs are trained to do that do take in student input, like the sensory profile for adolescents has a student survey, essentially, or rating scale that they go through, and then you get a standardized quotient from that as well. Okay, so we are going to keep moving on here in the sake of time. Thinking about executive functioning, and this is an umbrella term that really is describing all these cognitive processes that are involved in our conscious control of thoughts and actions. And so, more simply put, it is the thinking behind the doing. We know this has been closely linked to school success. And so we're going to take a little look at this video clip here and be thinking about how executive functioning is breaking down in these individuals.
Whoa, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are 2 people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something?
Help!
I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
Well, there's nothing else left to do, is there?
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
He said he could fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. He says he can fix it.
Okay, so I love this video too. That just always makes me laugh, chuckle a bit. And as we're looking at this, we see some of these breakdowns in executive functions. So when I was doing the research to write the book, kind of coming along, filling you in with my story, working full time, I had a very intense caseload. I worked at a federal setting for school, which if you're familiar with the United States federal settings, this is all special ed school, all self-contained classrooms. This is considered the least restrictive environment for these pupils. And so there was a high degree of behavior in this school, and it was often approached with a very kind of punished, met with a very kind of punitive approach to try to teach them a lesson. I didn't feel that my students were learning, nor did I agree with the way they were being treated. And so with that, I started to try to figure out what are some alternative ways. How do we truly teach them a lesson? What information do I need to better be able to build the skill set for them? So digging into executive functioning was one of the areas. And I continued after I got my bachelor's in OT and was working full time. I then continued to go on and get my graduate certificate in autism spectrum disorders and a master's in education. And through the coursework and applying it with my caseload, I got the idea of the zones, and I started using it a little bit with my population, and it was working. And the teachers were willing to carry it over and use the language, and the students it was impactful. We were seeing success. And some of my colleagues kept telling me, you need to write a book, you need to create a curriculum. And I thought, oh God, how do I do that? Super overwhelmed by the thought of doing that until I got to my last master's course, and it was my capstone. And they said, you can either do research or you can create a curriculum for your capstone completion. And so then I had this guidance and mentorship to take all these ideas, these activities, lessons, or treatment plans that I had for kids and really organize them in a curriculum model. However, I think it's just, fair to say I also got to do a tremendous amount of research and preparing to write this curriculum. So I dug into the executive functions area. What are the executive functions that kids on my caseload, looking specifically at the ADHD population and the ASD population, given the prevalence of kids with those diagnoses in our classrooms on our caseloads. And what are some of the executive functions those populations specifically seem to be lagging in when compared to non-disabled peers? And so that's where, in doing the research for writing the zones, I wanted it to make sure that the curriculum was going to be relevant to those populations' learning styles, that it taught skills in areas that they had more likely to see deficits in. And I integrated in what are the best practices of those populations and teaching them in their learning modalities as well. So we'll kind of keep sprinkling that in, but in regards to executive functioning, self-talk is an area that shows up as lagging. This is that internal speech we talked about. And this can be guiding and nurturing, or it can be detrimental. It can be deflating, defeating, more dysregulating. And so how do we help flip that switch? For some kids, it's even teaching them the awareness that they have this self-talk. And then it's helping them be able to, for example, once I couldn't find the keys to my car and I was rushing to get to another school site in the small window, and I start berating myself. You're so stupid, Leah. How could you lock your keys in the car? And then I caught myself and I said, Leah, just take a deep breath, methodically go through your bag. You know they're here somewhere. And then I was able to calm myself down, think, plan, problem solve, and find my keys, which had fallen out of the pocket, and my deep, dark therapy bag were in a bottom corner of it. So we need to be able to help them tap into that so they can use that self-talk to guide them, to nurture them. That impulse control, so many of our students, not just those identified as ADHD, have this overwhelming urge to act without thinking. And when you think about when met with a stressor, often the stressor, the trigger may vary, but how they respond is predictable. It's that go-to impulse, that instinct. So how can we help them override that and think through other options? So we're going to talk about that later when we do stop, opt, and go. Flexibility is this ability to consider multiple options, plan, need to be revised at times. We need to integrate the feedback from others, adapt to what's working, what's not. And so many of our students struggle with that. They get stuck on a one-track mind of doing something. They dig their heels in. So I find with my elementary age students, by mid-elementary school, they are pegged as difficult to work with. They struggle to work on teams or in partners. And this is a huge demand for kids in school. This project learning and group learning is a big piece of becoming a 21st century learner with more focus on that. And this is an area that really is impacting their ability to function in those groups, I see. And then working memory is a skill where we're able to essentially create these files in our brain. Think about our past experiences, and we pull that out to help get us organized and feel in a good place to approach something that's to come. So as you go into a continuing education day, you may think about, okay, well, if we were in a ballroom listening to Leah speak, I know I would bring lots of layers because often those are cold. The heating systems never work right. I'm going to bring some hard candy. I am going to get there early enough. I don't have to deal with traffic or parking, and I can sit with my friends. But now we're doing this remotely. So now that we've coded maybe some updated information now to help us with this new mode of learning. And ultimately, too, we use this to predict, to organize, to regulate, and we purge out what we don't need. So that way, when we have that working memory to tap into, we feel more grounded. Our behavior is more organized. Our anxiety is less than for those who don't have that working memory as accessible. It feels like they're going into a novel situation time and time again, even though it might be something that they've had a lot of exposure to. So Chris is an example. He's in some of my video clips to come. He's a kid, as a fourth grader, for example, I was watching him in the classroom and his teacher said, fourth graders, get out your math materials. And Chris sat there. And about 5 minutes in, she realized Chris's desk was empty. And she said, Chris, get out your math materials. And he sat there. 10 minutes in, she said, Chris, get out your blue folder. And Chris goes, oh, my blue folder. He wasn't trying to be defiant. And she saw that and she said, Chris, get out your math book. Oh, my math book. He just wasn't able to take math and break it down to, this has meant my blue folder and my math text. And we're on the protractor unit, so I'll grab that protractor. He was dependent on an adult really breaking down each step for him in order to get himself organized around something. So these are two experts in the field of executive functioning, Sarah Ward and Kristen Jacobson. Their website's there. Their website is also in your handouts in the back with the websites and resources section. So they have so many wonderful strategies if you get the chance to learn with them to address executive functioning. And one of their strategies is stop and read the room. STOP is an acronym for space, time, objects, people. And so you take a student like Chris, and rather than have them be prompt dependent on staff to say, get your blue folder, get your math text, we can be teaching Chris to think about the space he is and where am I at? What's the expectations for this environment? What's the time of day? The schedule saying math. What's the objects I'm seeing? What materials are needed during this time? And looking around at the people, what are they doing? They're pulling out math texts. They're pulling out protractors. And so he can be matching his behavior to those salient clues in the environment around him when taught to stop and read the room. So Aristotle says anyone can be angry. That is easy, but to be angry with the right person to the right degree at the right time for the right purpose and in the right way, this is not easy. And this certainly, I feel, captures this emotional regulation piece that we need to understand. Emotions are innate. That's human nature. And so I'm going to say this again. We're not in the business of telling kids how they should or should not feel. We are accepting that all feelings are okay, that we all have feelings, including uncomfortable feelings. What we can be doing, though, is help individuals learn how to monitor, manage, modify this intensity, the duration of these emotional responses so that their behavior is more adaptive to what's unfolding around them. So we have intrinsic processes at place. We have this brainstem, there's the amygdala there that has where we process these big feelings like fear, anger from there. And then we have the prefrontal cortex that is in communication with the brainstem. And that helps us modulate these emotions, make sense of them, tells us that maybe there isn't anything to fear, that we are safe. And so we can be using that kind of caveman mammalian brain with this higher level functioning brain to approach the different emotions we have and manage and make sense of them. But then we also have outside processes at place. For example, time of year is one. Think about how those students feel that week before they go into winter break. You can throw in the chat some of the feelings your kids feel. They're excited, they're anxious, they're giddy, they're wild. There's a whole bunch of kind of energy boiling with those kids. And then think about those, many of us have lost someone that we won't be celebrating maybe some holidays with. And so that grief might become more present again because of the time of the year and the memories that come with that time of year. So our emotional regulation is also so tied into our social cognition as we're aging up, I said. And this social cognition, or what we talk about as theory of mind, is the ability to understand that others' thoughts, feelings, experiences are different than yours. And this is so critical in being able to understand social norms and help us figure out how to manage these emotions we experience and express our behavior in a way that's adaptive to the social setting around us, the people in our environment. So I think about these mornings I've had sometimes before work where it's like one thing after another is going wrong. And I might be bawling on the way into the office because of maybe I got a ticket and one morning I got ran over by a dog walking to my car and ripped my pants, skinned my knees. It had already been a tough morning. The babysitter hadn't shown up for my son. I was running late and I just had enough and I was melting down, calling my husband crying. But then I get into the office and I'm greeted by my administrator, and she says, "Good morning, Leah. How are you?" And what do I say? "I'm fine. How are you?" And I'm not necessarily fine, but I want her to feel like I'm capable and competent. And so I'm able to regulate externally my behavior to keep her thinking these positive thoughts about me. And so this is something that many of our students struggle with, really understanding and fully being able to take into account this social environment and how that plays in. So we're going to watch this fun little clip where this unfolds and be thinking about who's struggling to self-regulate, who's struggling to co-regulate, and who's struggling with understanding the social context in here. Okay, so this clip here, Molly just put into the chat if you're interested in that. But I I would say, both these characters struggled with regulation. That green guy was too much for the red guy. He was not co-regulating around the red guy and kind of the energy he brought to the playground. He also wasn't using his theory of mind. He made an assumption that this red guy must be here to also play on the playground equipment, and wasn't reading the body language like that the red guy was providing to help co-regulate around him. The red guy was struggling with that regulation piece too. He kept it kind of down at a simmer for a while, and then it just blew, and it felt scary. It was too intense for the situation. So to help us with this is Michelle Garcia Winner. She is a speech and language pathologist, and she is the creator of social thinking and a whole bunch of materials under that kind of framework, that umbrella, that help to teach these social competencies and really help individuals understand how the social world works, rather than explicitly teach social rules or social skills that aren't adaptable to kind of the unfolding social environment around us. So she's really teaching people to observe and to be able to better think socially to guide their behavior. She talks about we're sharing space, we're sharing thoughts. And so we regulate around those individuals, even if we don't know them. Excuse me. We work to regulate around them so that they feel safe, secure in our presence, that they have comfortable thoughts about us. And this can really be something we can be teaching those who struggle with that, so that they are becoming more aware of how others perceive them, and use that information to guide how they manage themselves. So you'll find in the Zones curriculum that there's some of the social thinking concepts integrated into the Zones. Michelle is my publisher, and she was a mentor as I worked to take the book I wrote for my curriculum, or for my capstone, and morph it into the book it is today, that's published and accessible for the public. So with that, we took some of Michelle's core concepts and wove them into the Zones lessons to further enrich the teachings around this area. So you'll see expected and unexpected behavior related to how we're managing our zones, and how that may be creating good thoughts or uncomfortable thoughts for people around us. We talk about how your behavior may change my thoughts and feelings. We use social behavior maps, which is one of Michelle's strategies she developed to think about how we can be managing our zones. Size of the problem and Superflex are also tools that are from Michelle's work that are adapted into the Zones curriculum. So to kind of pull it all together here, I want to end with the work of someone I highly respect, Dr. Ross Greene. And when I was early in my career trying to figure out how do I support my caseload, and feeling really disgusted by this kind of climate that these kids are naughty and they need to be taught a lesson, I found Ross Greene's Explosive Child book. And in there, he talks about how kids do well if they can, not if they want to. And it just struck a chord with me. It is my core belief. And I saw so much good in all these kids, but I didn't see the skills to consistently be able to behave and manage in that way. So we think about, Ross talks about challenges occur when a task or situation outstrip our capacity to cope. I can tell you that holds true for me, that as an adult, when challenges are occurring and they pile up, it outstrips me. And I maybe get too short with my kids, or I maybe let my anxiety get the best of me, and my head's spinning, my heart's pounding. I'm not managing it in healthy ways. So it's our job to discover lagging skills. We can be looking at, rather than punish them for the lack of skills, what do we need to teach them to do something different, more adaptive, more pro-social? And Ross's work is collaborative and proactive solutions. That's a strategy I use as a provider, as a parent, as a spouse, as a friend, where we can just meet someone where they're at with empathy and respect and work to problem solve to find a collaborative solution forward. And so Ross's website, Lives in the Balance, has a ton of information on it. He is very generous with his work. He is also has many YouTube clips that you can hear him speak. And I really think it's important, as Ross says, we need to check our lenses. And if your school climate or your site that you're at's climate is that these kids are naughty, that they need to be taught a lesson, I really encourage you to hold off starting the zones and first work on changing the climate of how we're understanding kids with challenging behavior and looking at underlying deficits that are impacting them and teaming together to figure out how are we going to build skills. The same would be true if they had a reading or academic deficit, if they had motor impairments, language delays. We look at what are those underlying skills that we need to teach them, what adaptations and modifications need to be put in place to support them. And we do so with a great amount of respect. That same mentality needs to carry over to our kids with regulation challenges. So if you see these boys here, this is my son and his cousins. They're preschool age here. And if any of them drop their cone, we would expect them to what? Cry, whine, fuss, right? And as a caregiver, we would likely buy them a new one or help in an empathetic way problem solve the situation. However, let's fast forward, and instead of being 4, let's say they're 14 and they drop their ice cream cone and they cry, whine, fuss. What then is likely going to be the caregiver response in that scenario? You know, maybe it's like, suck it up, don't act like a baby. The point being is age does not equal expectations for a lot of these kids. They don't have that ability to suck it up or not act like a baby. And labeling them and demeaning them is not helping the situation. What we know is that each individual is unique. And so let's try to meet them where they're at and have that lens that this might be the best that they're able to do in that moment. So think about this as an invisible disability and something that we can really team around to help address and build skills and support. Be mindful that we each have our own coping capacity. A branch just fell on the roof and it startled me. We each have our own coping capacity. And our reservoir is always changing. So some days it's going to be more abundant. We got a good night's sleep. We had a healthy breakfast, positive interactions. And some nights days it's going to be very depleted. And I guess that's where I'm asking for your grace because mine's fairly depleted right now. But think about some of these kids. Maybe they were up all night listening to caregivers fight and argue. Dad's nowhere to be found in the morning. Mom's too distraught to eat breakfast. And then this kid gets teased as he's kind of tearing up on the bus for being a baby. His teacher doesn't notice him as he comes into the classroom. Is he set up for success that day? Absolutely not. And so it is our job to empathize, support, meet them where they're at, and teach them rather than punish, shame, and demean. And we need to have the understanding some days are going to be better than others. I've seen all too often individuals try to hold these kids at a standard that is just not attainable. They say to me, well, they've done it once, they can do it before. But I'm here to tell you that does not hold true. Just because they did it once doesn't mean that that's always going to be the case. And we need to make allowances and take into account what is their capacity in this moment. And So when we think about how we approach behavior, and so often we have these behavior systems set up. We separate the good from the bad behavior. There's kind of this sorting system, and sometimes it feels more like a shaming system. My son came home from preschool and he told me something to the effect of, Mommy, my owl will never leave the branch. So what is he talking about? And then it was abundantly clear when we were talking about kids for his birthday party. And I mentioned one girl's name and he goes, Mommy, her owl's always off the branch. She's the naughty girl in class. And this girl is 4. So what are we telling these little kids? What sort of, stereotype are we assigning to them, label, stigma? And we know a ton about self-fulfilling prophecy. You tell a kid that they're naughty, bad enough times, that is who they are going to embody. And their behavior will play out to represent that then. So we really need to shift our approach. Think about these kids who are constantly flagged as being not able to meet the standards in the classroom, that many of them, they don't learn the lesson. There's a subgroup of kids, say the majority of kids, I was one of them, when I got in trouble in school, that was so impactful for me. I still remember those instances very clearly today as an adult. In 3rd grade, I got caught dancing on the table during indoor recess, and I was mortified. I was told I needed to make arrangements to serve at detention the next day, and I became too physically ill to even come to school that next day. I let my parents down. I let my teacher down. I let myself down. And I never danced on the tables again until college. So I was one of those kids, like many of the kids in our classrooms, who can make those adjustments based on, learning their lesson. But we have a group of students too that it doesn't matter how many times you punish them or what that punishment looks like. They don't have the skills to do anything differently. And so they will continually be punished, continually be penalized. So as we think about what we can do to be supporting them, let's first and foremost be taking into account some of these foundational needs, that there is no amount of zones that we can teach and apply without making sure some of these basic needs are met. So access to food, water during the day, and thinking about when they are coming in hungry, maybe stashing granola bars at our desks. There's also a lot to be said of hangry. Blood sugar, that chemistry really does emotionally impact some individuals more than others. And for my son, for example, he starts getting irritable, grouchy, he knows now. He goes, Mommy, I need a snack. And it's his first go-to to help him regulate is just to put a little food in his stomach again. And it's almost, it's really crazy how impactful that is, just to put some food in his stomach, and has his mood improve significantly. Think about the environment that they're accessing their lunch too, for example. Some kids eat in the cafeteria, and one of my kindergartners was so overwhelmed by the sensory stimuli in there, he left his lunch untouched day after day. But just moving the environment where he ate lunch made a significant improvement then in his afternoons, and is able to take on the challenges, the stressors of his day. And so also many kids find relief in getting the movement to get up and get a drink, or being able to suck on a water bottle throughout the day can both be really regulating, plus the just benefit of water and how much our bodies need water to maintain a more healthy state. Individuals, we all need exercise. Kids need play, and integrating this into our routines as well. This kindergartner. I was in his classroom and his teacher said, kindergartners, I know you've been sitting for 45 minutes and I need 15 minutes more out of you. An hour to ask kindergartners to sit is ridiculous. And my student already had his name flipped on the board. He was rocking in his chair. He wasn't square in his chair and was being penalized for it as a result. So there's a lot of great resources to help integrate movement and play. And some of the things that I've found effective, brain gym movements integrated into the day. I've done some partnering with 1000 Pedals, and they have kind of branched from Yoga Calm and created these Move Mindfully routines and card decks that are designed to put movement and yoga and mindfulness into the classroom using just the equipment we have there. Thinking about Go Noodle, a lot of kids find that fun, and there's lots of movement activities. They also have some really nice calming activities. So after the fun, moving, and craziness, you can also do some nice breathing and mindfulness with Go Noodle too. Kids need sleep. I will take the gamble of letting a kid rest for 20 minutes and likely having a better day than keeping them up. And now we're walking on eggshells and hoping that things don't kind of boil over into something more in the day. So love and security is the last point I really want to make. They need this from their caregivers, but never underestimate how much they need it from you. This is such an integral place to start for feeling safe and secure. And if they don't feel that with you when they're in your care at school or the clinic or wherever you may be working with them, they are going to not have that foundation to take on other challenges, other risks. They will be in a more state of heightened alert. So we need to be that anchor for them. We need to give them that foundation. That may mean that we need to spend time building that relationship, that trust, that rapport before we're able to go on to other skills we're trying to teach them, because this will give us that foundation. And when we don't have that love, that security, that trust with our caregivers, with our teachers, with our educational assistants, it can be very dysregulating for the individual. Joey, the high schooler I was telling you about, we were looking at his data and we were noticing he was shutting down every day during math and science. And I used Ross Green's collaborative problem solving. I said, Joey, I'm noticing that you are in the blue zone during math and science when you're graphing yourself. What's up? What's going on? And with a little discussion, he says, well, they don't know me and they sure don't know autism. And this was such an easy intervention to just have him go into these teachers' rooms during prep. And he brought a preferred activity. He was super into making duct tape wallets and billfolds, things like that. And so he just chit-chatted with them and showed off his duct tape making skills, made them these wallets, and it had a profound impact on his performance in their classrooms, not just his regulatory skills, but also his academic participation and achievement. So with that, we are going to take our 15-minute break right now. And when we come back, we're going to jump into the zones. So do what you need in the next 15 minutes to get yourself in a good place. And we'll come back for a whole bunch of learning around what we can do to support all this. I hear from many teachers, they don't feel that they need a classroom behavior system once they integrate the zones into their classroom. And I think as you listen, as this day unfolds, you'll be seeing how we can be framing the conversations, the supports we're providing to students in a different lens to be co-regulating and making accessible strategies, tools that they can use to regulate rather than relying on behavior charts to try to curb their behavior. So thinking about the zones of regulation, we certainly are referencing this book, this curriculum here, but what this really is aimed at teaching is this framework for thinking. It's a way to simplify all these different ways we feel, our energy levels, our states of arousal into this 4 designated zones. So we are easier able to capture where we're at. We now have this easy language. And as we talked about development of regulation, so many of our kids were bridging from using behavior strategies to trying to build language strategies. And so this gives us that universal language we can be using to talk about this, to co-regulate around this. It gives us a nonverbal way to communicate with the visual structure that this integrates in. And so we can be pointing, we can be showing where we're at, how we're feeling. And it systemizes this. We're taking a complex skill here and we're making it systematic by color coding it into these 4 color zones. And with that awareness of what zone we're in, then we're accessing what are my tools for that zone and essentially setting up this pathway. When I'm in this zone, here are my strategies that I know help me manage and regulate. Versus in this colored zone, I have a different set of feelings and these tools are better served to help me regulate in that zone. So you may be thinking, well, we don't all talk about the zones. We don't all, not everyone knows that language, but for schools that do use it school-wide, it is a universal language in that setting. But again, what we're aiming to teach is this cognitive way to think. So if I have a show of hands, how many of you are already familiar with the zones of regulation? I'll give you a second to weigh in there. So it looks like about half of you are. Now, I want you to think about how many of you find yourself thinking in the zones. Maybe you say, oh my gosh, I'm living in the yellow zone right now, or I'm just stuck in the blue zone today. And you're an adult, but this framework of thinking has just been something that you've now integrated into helping you with self-management. I certainly know that I'm one of those people, and my family talks to me in the zones, and places I work have integrated the language in that where just the adults, they say, I'm in the yellow today. I don't have the capacity to be a good listener right now. So as we internalize this process, we are building this cognitive way to organize our thoughts around how we're feeling and our ways to manage those feelings. So as we jump in here, these kiddos are going to kick us off with their zones wrap.
Check your dojo. Blue zone, green zone, yellow zone, red zone. We go through them all. Blue zone, mystery. Green zone, yo-yo. Yellow zone, slow down. Red zone, stop, yo. Check your dojo. Check your dojo. Blue zone, you may feel extra relaxed. Start sleepy tag. You need to rest, yo. Green zone, your focus, yo. You are calm, happy, okay, and ready to go. Yellow zone, you may be silly, excited, frustrated, or fidgety. Red zone, stop, yo. Red zone, angry, and out of control, yo. Check your dojo. Everyone goes through the zones, but the green zone is the expected zone to be at school, yo. At school it will be hard to do your work when you are red, yellow, and blue. But it can work when you are green. Use your tools to help you get back to green. A tool when you're yellow is deep breathing. A tool when you're blue is stretching. A tool when you are red is up and think. Check your dojo. Check your dojo. Check your dojo. Back to green, ready to go. What's your tool to get to green?
Okay, a couple takeaways from that. One is I love the climate of this classroom. It's not one kid identified with regulation issues. We all are working on regulation, and they are setting up the climate. All the zones are okay. We all have feelings, and this is a comfortable, a safe place to talk about that. And when we create that comfortable climate, we help each other co-regulate within that climate. The other thing that I feel that this video illustrates is that they're having fun with it. The teacher found a way to make this work meaningful and engaging for her students, as they had really been trying to pressure her to create a zones wrap around this. And so she saw that that would be something they were motivated to help and use that as a learning tool then to teach the pieces of this. So when we're thinking about what the zones framework is, it's a teaching tool. And I want to be very clear and blunt that with a teaching tool, you're putting in time up front if you're expecting to get the results on the back end. This is a lot more than putting colored visuals on your wall and saying we're doing the zones. We are taking some time and giving students opportunity to learn the information, process it, and opportunities to practice, reflect, and demonstrate their learning in safe environments before we're expecting them to be able to self-regulate. There's a whole curriculum outlining how to approach this and give you lessons and strategies to help build the skill set. So it's instilling this cognitive framework, as I said, easy way to approach how we're feeling, think about it, communicate, and provide the system so we can overlearn our responses. When I'm in the red zone in this heightened state, my go-to doesn't need to be hitting or destroying. I can take a break, or I can use my deep breathing. And so we're creating the system to think about and approach regulation. It's intended to nurture the development of skills and be supportive in nature, non-judgmental. So what this isn't, it's not a discipline model. There is no good or bad zone. There's no consequence or punishment for being in one of the zones. It should not sound negative, judgmental, shaming, punitive. So this does not stand as a behavior approach, and that there shouldn't be points for being in one zone or whatnot. So this can be overlaid with a tiered system approach. Maybe you're using MTSS, multi-tiered systems of supports, formerly RTI or PBIS. And in that scenario, maybe the whole school is getting exposure to lessons. There's common language being established to help with generalization and stabilization across the different settings in the school. Everyone is able to communicate and co-regulate with each other. We have visuals across settings. All students have some instruction in the zones. And then you can take your tier 2 kids, those kids identified at risk, needing more support, and create small group instructions, deeper exploration of the curriculum and tools, be setting up more self-monitoring. And your tier 3 kids get highly individualized instruction and support. So that's just an example of how it can be used with the tiered system. It can also be used in conjunction with other social emotional learning supports. For example, many schools in Minneapolis Public use Second Step. And what they found is laying the groundwork of the zones for the first, say, 6 weeks of school, and then starting Second Step allows them to teach Second Step to a deeper level by weaving in the zone's language, the zone's visuals and frameworks with the Second Step lessons, and really combining those two supports to deepen learning. So the zones isn't going to be your one and done. I really see it as a collaborative approach. What I feel it does strongly is creates this systematic approach to regulation, this language, these visuals that then can be used and overlaid with other social emotional learning supports. So the goals of the curriculum is to teach kids, individuals to identify their feelings, their level of alertness. I find many individuals can't really sort out where kind of this state of arousal ends and this feeling begins. So, it's like my son might be jumping on his bed telling me he feels silly. And he's also in a hyper aroused state, but I'm not exactly gung-ho to teach him to say, Mommy, I feel hyper aroused. It's not necessarily kid-friendly language either. So the zones is a nice little bridge to help be able to capture and communicate how we're feeling. We are working to find effective regulation tools. It was kind of this like aha moment. I think about that emoji of the person hitting their forehead, where this student and I were conversing. I was just getting to know him. And she shared with me that he gets angry very easily. And so, well, do you have any tools or strategies that help you when you get angry? And he thought for a moment, and then he said, count to 10, I suppose. I said, how's that working for you? And he said, it's not. My mom and teacher just keep telling me to do it. And I got to thinking, did one of these, how many times have I imposed on a student, and you can raise your hand if you're with me here, your technique that you think would be the best one for them, but they don't have the buy-in. They're not empowered by that tool. They don't necessarily find it effective. We're just trying to problem solve this for them. So if we can flip this script and really allow them the exploration of tools and them to figure out how they're impacting them, they then will be more likely to buy into these tools. They notice the impact. They're empowered now to use it, and they feel skilled and confident in being able to execute using these tools in these higher stress scenarios. So we specifically teach when and how to use our tools, and we practice this when we're in calm, regulated states. We problem solve positive solutions and address that within the zones. Understanding how the social impact is impactful and used to figure out how we regulate, and ultimately work towards moving towards more independent regulation. But I want to be really transparent here that not every kid is going to be able to independently self-regulate at the end of this. Each individual's timetable is going to be unique to themselves. And so I really encourage you to allow students to be your pacer and measure progress within each student rather than comparing them to where their peers are. Because some of our students won't catch up to where their peers are, but it doesn't mean they won't make progress. Self-regulation is not always the goal that we're working towards. For some kids, if they are able to expand the number of feelings they identify in others, or even identify a feeling in others, label it, that might be a huge step forward. If they're able to use that feeling language to express to a caregiver, teacher, that would be a huge step for many of our kids. If they're more receptive to practicing tools, widen their variety of coping strategies, are receptive to a prompt to use a tool, that might be a huge success. So there's a lot of skills we can be working towards without having that expectation that they're all going to self-regulate at the end of this too. So when we're thinking about what the zones are, we are talking about what we're feeling on the inside. It's our feelings, our energy, these emotions, these levels of arousal that we use to identify our zone. That may or may not match our behavior on the outside. So when we're looking at identifying our zone, for some individuals, behavior might give us clues into how we're feeling. But as we get more skilled at regulation, our behavior may appear very calm, capable, content on the outside, and inside we may be an emotional wreck. So that's where zones gets to what's on the inside. And you can use the traffic themes if that's going to be something motivating for your student. But for the, say, secondary age population, they might see that as babyish. If you're working with students with cognitive impairments, younger preschool age kids that don't really understand the traffic themes, then you don't need it. It's there for those as just an additional cueing of how we work to regulate our different zones. Kind of a fun theme we can weave into this. So getting into each of the 4 zones, the blue zone describes when we're in this lower state of alertness. Our energy is down. We might be feeling sad, sick, tired, bored. So I pair it with the rest area. That's where we go to regroup, get energy, comfort. And for many of us, this is common when we wake up in the morning. After lunch, when we put a lot of our energy into digestion, we might feel our energy drop a bit and be in that blue zone. The green zone, is when we're in a calm, organized state of alertness. We have neutral emotions, more neutral energy here. We may be feeling happy, content, focused, proud, ready to learn in that green zone. So I pair it with the go light. We're often good to go in the green zone, but I really want to take a second to address this kind of misnomer out there that we have to be in the green zone in the classroom. And I think it's really important that we don't set that up as the expectation. The green zone is optimal for learning and often socializing, but many of our kids do not come to us in the green zone. And there is nothing magical about walking into the classroom that is going to wipe away all the maybe unrest and anxiety and frustration and feelings that some of these kids are coming to us with. So take that boy I was saying who was up all night listening to his parents fight. He's probably in the blue zone as he comes into the classroom and feeling down. And what the zones is about is helping him be able to understand the way he's feeling and find healthy pro-social ways to manage those feelings. So he can still participate in the class discussions and get through the work and keep his peers and teacher around him comfortable. But it's not about having to get to the green zone. So maybe he uses some blue zone tools to help him manage that blue zone. Maybe he finds a safe adult that he trusts in the school to take a walk with. Maybe it's a comfort object that he accesses and keeps with him at his desk. Maybe it's taking a little break in the comfort corner in the classroom before he joins the rest of the kids on the rug for morning meeting. So it's about helping him manage that zone so he can meet those goals and task demands and the social expectations, but it's not about having to feel happy in the green zone. The yellow zone is when we have a more heightened state, but we still have some of this cognitive control. Our energy is up. Our emotions are maybe a little more elevated or intense. But I still think about us being able to access those executive functions a little easier. Our emotions aren't so intense yet. So I pair with the caution sign. Just take notice, be aware, maybe slow down. we might feel frustrated or stressed, anxious, worried, this uneasy unrest, excitement, silliness. So it can be positive states, maybe when we used to have plans on the weekends, we were giddy Friday afternoon because of what was going to, happen over the weekend. We might feel wiggly, agitated in that yellow zone. Some of our sensory kids often identify being in that yellow zone state. And then the red zone is when we have these big heightened feelings. We might be in that fight, flight, fright, freeze mode. We might be feeling positive emotions like elated, ecstatic. And so this is not the bad zone. This is just a zone that represents these really big, overwhelming feelings. So, maybe it's my son, he shared with me one day after school, he said, Mom, my whole class was in the red zone. I said, oh, tell me about it. And he goes, we won the school readathon and we get to have this special party that all the classrooms were competing for. And so that was this, euphoric moment for their class where they were all jumping up, cheering, that kind of overjoyed state. So we can be, enraged, angered, devastated, that terror, panic in that red zone too. So often we have to stop and figure out, how do we manage these feelings? These emotions are draining for us. They take a lot of energy. So I really want to make sure that we're not associating the red as the bad zone. Molly just put up an article I wrote on this too, that all the zones are okay, that you can read more and help educate more around this if there's kind of misuse to this. But there's times we're all in the red zone. Then when the fire alarm goes off in the school, many of us are in a red zone state. As kids play on the playground, and they're in the yellow. As kids compete in sports, they may be more in this yellow and maybe sometimes even kind of an aggressive red zone state as they're competing. So all that is okay. We're just working to manage these zones too, so our behavior is expected. So I'm going to give you a moment here to think about, how are you feeling and what zone are you in? And I'm going to launch this poll here. You can vote if you would like, and we can see where we're falling. Will you do that? I'm going to catch up with some of the questions that have come in too. Okay, I'll share the results here. We had the majority of us in the green zone, and some in the blue, yellow, and red. And so the next question is thinking about, do you need to use any tools to help you manage your zone? And we're going to talk more about what that looks like as we go forward. And I see Mary Jane is in Australia, and she said it's almost 2 a.m. in the morning there. She's definitely in the blue zone. And so thank you for hanging in with us as we, many of you are tuning in, and it is the middle of the night for you. As there's lots of questions coming in, I'm trying to look at what is going to be the most pertinent for this whole group, and what will naturally be answered as we go forward. Amy asked about, could you define feelings, energy, and levels of arousal? I know it might seem obvious, but sometimes there are subtleties that overlooked. This is a great question because I think if we think too much about it, it gets too complicated. So I try to keep it simple. And as we talk about it, we'll look more at, we have different, we might be in more than one zone at a time as we build more awareness. And an emotion might have such high energy, it puts us into a different zone because the intensity of that energy with that feeling. So it's meant to be a simple, easy way to kind of capture the way you're feeling. And there is certainly complexities to this that we can find caveats and nuances of this. But I find that the simplicity of it is what makes it feel approachable for students, for staff, for parents, and that they, in essence, are able to then be able to recognize, okay, this is the general sense of like the states, the feelings. When I say states, I am talking about those levels of alertness. Like I'm in a heightened level of alertness. I'm on high alert. My heart is pumping. My eyes are dilated. My muscles are tense. That's a heightened state of physiological arousal. Our nervous system is sensing that maybe there's, a danger. And then the feeling might be that we're experiencing fear. Hopefully that helps clear it up with still being vague. So some external factors are the context, the situation, plus the people around us, the task demands, what's being asked of us, what are our goals, what do we want to accomplish, whether that's short-term or long-term. So here's just another way to put this. Oh, and this is funny. Okay, there we go. So our zones equation for regulation. So context is fluid. It's all around us and it's evolving. And within our context, we get triggered. We have a situation that unfolds and that can cause us to change feelings, move into a different zone. So in our zones lessons, lesson 9 is about identifying triggers that move us out of the green zone. So let's take a context, this a trigger that might be unfolding here. So I can think about, there's just been so many triggers lately. I'm trying to do something that's applicable for this moment that we live in right now. So maybe I'll just take distant learning. We have, say, my mommy's trying to work. She's on a meeting with her colleagues, or say I'm on my meeting with you right now. And my trigger is one of my own kids comes up to me, needing attention, needing support in some way. And that is then going to perhaps impact my state, my internal state, because I'm maybe feeling, my heart starts pounding. I feel this tightness come over me. I'm like, oh my gosh, I got all you watching, or I'm in this, meeting room with all these colleagues. I got this kid who is screaming beside me. And there is then this feeling of maybe some panic, some feeling of this, stress of the situation. So let's say I'm in the red zone in that situation. Do I need to manage it? Well, I want you to stay engaged. I want you to have a positive thought about me. I'm motivated to get you this information today. So I am going to have to probably use some tools and take some deep breaths and try to problem solve how I can help my child while continuing to move on in this webinar in this moment. Or not. And say all of a sudden I start screaming at my kid, get out of here, you know I'm giving a webinar. Mommy cannot talk right now. And I'm raising my voice and have this moment where I do create uncomfortable feelings for others. And it's interfering with me delivering this information to you and providing you this webinar today. But now say that there's a different context. Let's take this, and there's not the pressure of a live audience. There's not the meeting going on, and you have the trigger of your kid coming to you, and they're upset, and they are demanding your attention. And the internal state is, oh, this is so impossible, and I'm feeling flustered and frustrated. But maybe your demand is that you're just trying to clean up the kitchen now. That's what's unfolding around you. So you might still be in that red zone state. How you manage it though may be different. Maybe you can, the task demand of not getting the kitchen clean right now is not a big deal, and you can support them in a different way. Hopefully you still don't yell at them in that same way and kind of unleash on them, though there's not the social audience in the same way had you been doing that as if you did it live in front of your colleagues or coworkers or whatnot. That doesn't make it right, but it's honestly probably more likely to happen in many homes in that situation. So with that, there's a lot of complexity to this. There's many layers of it, but we're also trying to create a pathway to be approaching this and thinking through these different nuances that go into how do we regulate, how do we manage in the moment. One of the things that I've worked with my colleagues to create is another way to teach this. And this is Navigating the Zones. This is our board game. And we're working to teach pathways to regulation through this. So this is designed for students 8 and up. And the board game is taught the introductory level is in the board game. And then there's 3 more levels of play that add more complexity, that integrating competitiveness and more gaming, so that there is kind of more real-time stressors and things to problem solve and more strategic play to try to win as we increase the competitiveness of that. And that's introduced in the advanced pack and the game cards that are included with that accessory product. And so what you see there is these 4 zones that we work to navigate into that center destination regulation. And the individuals are dealt cards that include situations, that include feelings, and that show different colored tools without naming a tool. So blue zone tool, yellow zone tool, for example. And what they're working to do is look at their cards that they have in their hand and determine with the empty pathways, say I have a card of I have to stay home from school, and I have a feeling, the situation I have to stay home from school, the feeling is disappointment, and the blue zone's open. So I might lay my 2 cards on that. And I don't have a blue zone tool, so play passes to my neighbor next to me. They have the option then to lay cards on a different pathway that may be available, or they can work to finish this pathway. So say they have a blue zone tool card, they lay it down, and then they have to announce a tool. So stay home from school, feeling disappointed. My tool is going to be I'm going to doodle or drop. Then they move on to this checkpoint, which allows for reflection. And this, you'll find there's a lot of cognitive behavior therapy woven into the zones curriculum. So we're giving them the opportunity to think about and monitor what's the likely outcomes of this. Does this make sense? And so they're asked to act it out or talk it out and kind of flesh it out. They can recruit another player to role play. And then everyone gets to vote at the checkpoint. Do they get to proceed ahead? Was this a logical way to navigate through the blue zone? Or do we need to reroute and maybe find a different tool that would be better? And if they get to proceed ahead, they get to collect the cards and they get the destination regulation packet that they put them in. And collectively, we work together as a team to get as many of those destination regulation packets. As I said, as you integrate in the advanced pack, then now the cards become more complex in the situations. We double the amount of feelings that are on the cards. And in levels 3 and 4, we start adding competitiveness. And so you might add in, so we say this is more for tweens and teens. And we start then with some of these game cards where it's maybe stuck in the zone. And when I go and play that, and we've also now, we're competing to earn the most regulation, destination regulation packets for ourselves rather than collectively as a team. So I'm about to lay my blue zone tool and go to the act it out, talk it out. And someone lays a stuck in the zone card on my blue zone tool. That requires me to have either another blue zone tool, and I have to come up with 2 tools to navigate that zone. Or if I don't have another blue zone tool, they get to try to steal it from me who played the card. And if they have a blue zone tool, they can announce the tool. They get to move through the checkpoint and they get to do collect the packet. There's also the Pathway My Way card. And so I maybe collected my blue zone pathway packet, but now someone plays the Pathway My Way card. They get to take it from me. They pull out the situation card. You have to stay home from school, and they're going to say, I feel worried in that situation, and they have to navigate it from a different zone. So they're picking a yellow zone feeling, worried, and now they need a tool to manage that yellow zone pathway. And so maybe they would say, I'm going to use my self-talk. And during the act it out, talk it out, they role play that they're worried about missing work and getting behind, and they use their self-talk to remind themselves that they can email their teacher or catch up. It won't be a huge problem. And then they can potentially steal that whole packet from them. So that's just a little bit about what this is. What we're trying to do, though, is really cement this kind of more systematic way to think about approach regulation and give them a fun and engaging way to really practice and process this learning. So talking about behavior, behavior does not determine our zone. I really see it as the byproduct. And when we manage our zone in a way that's expected, our behavior meets the demands of what's unfolding around us. And it's expected, people are comfortable. So this is that social thinking language used in conjunction with the zones. If our behavior is unexpected, we're not managing our zone well, people may be uncomfortable around us. So thinking about behavior, I said earlier, we may use some of our behavior to help us initially learn how to recognize and identify our feelings and zones. But as we do get better at managing our zones, we may not have necessarily that behavior associated with it. I believe there's a question that came into the chat around this. Sorry, it's kind of hard to see all the questions that are in here. Let's see. Sorry, there's just too many for me to switch. Sarah, asked about. However, I love that all the zones are okay. However, do you say that hitting is okay when talking about the red zone? So getting more specific about that, we may help kids see that when they're in that red zone, when they're feeling really angry, that their behavior may be, I hit, or my hands are tight, and I know I'm in the red zone if I'm hitting, but that doesn't mean hitting's okay in the red zone. The zones are about our feeling, and we can learn other ways to take care of our red zone. We can take a break. We can talk to a teacher. We can use our breathing. So no, when teaching to some kids, especially kids who are younger, lower cognition, they can sometimes really capture their zone based on that behavior that is initially associated with these feelings. But then we're working to replace that maladaptive behaviors with more healthy coping strategies to express their feelings, their zones in a way that's more adaptive. So some important points, and if you take nothing else away, there is no bad zone, and it's natural to experience all four of the zones. We're all working to manage our zone according to goals, social context, environmental demands. And so I find the best way to teach this is to model this. Help kids see that you move through the zones. Check in the morning with them. Tell them, I'm feeling exhausted. To be honest, I came up north to escape the chaos and mayhem that's going on in my city. And at 2:00 in the morning, a million sirens are blasting around me. And at first I thought I was back in Minneapolis. And I reminded myself, no, I'm 2 hours away from Minneapolis. What is going on? And it's, I guess there was a boat accident in the middle of the night. And a lot of first responders came. So I am exhausted. I'm checking in the blue zone. I already wasn't sleeping well and worried about what sort of chaos might be moving in this direction. So anyway, that's just my side story and just another layer. So what's going on with me? But that's things I would tell my kids, maybe not that there's a boating accident, but I don't want to create fear, but just that, hey, I'm checking in the blue zone this morning. I'm feeling exhausted, or I'm in the yellow zone. There's a lot of stress going on in my life right now. I'm getting towards the red zone, guys. I'm feeling very, very frustrated. And then we can be modeling these healthy ways to manage these feelings. I need to take a break. I'm going to take a deep breath right now. I need to go get a drink of water to help energize myself again. So the more we can set the tone and they can see us, they can hear us, essentially we're lending our frontal lobe to them, they're going to become more comfortable in this. And we're creating this climate that it's okay to have these feelings. And I'm going to model for you healthier, more adaptive ways to manage these feelings. And what I find when we do create these climates then is we start co-regulating better around each other. Kids start helping kids with regulation. And another cool thing is they see kids' behavior not from that behavior lens anymore, but they understand it from an emotional lens. That they see he's feeling worried, she's feeling sad, he's feeling angry, instead of, he's just nodding because he's doing X, Y, and Z. And I think that's been a really positive climate for many of these kids to have better emotional awareness of each other because we're talking about it, their safety in this setting to be able to identify and communicate how we're feeling. So some caveats. And so with that climate, the more we can expand it to home, classrooms, after school, especially right now in the age of COVID, helping families use this information while they're at home. With my parent hat on, this is very hard to be the primary caregiver and the teacher. And it's, there's kids with a lot of big feelings right now, mine included. So the more we can help the caregivers feel equipped, that's going to help transfer these skills into the home too. On my website, I do have some information to, I created a little video to help kids create their own zones check-ins for home. And there's a little printable with that too that they can use. So then these caveats, you can be in more than one zone at a time. As kids get more insight around this, they're gonna tell you that I'm feeling tired in the blue zone and I'm also feeling anxious in the yellow zone. That's probably where I would be checking in right now. You can also take emotions and think about the gradation of them. We can think about, I am excited in the yellow zone to like ecstatic in the red zone. I am just a teeny bit jealous, but in the green to I am overcome with jealousy in the red. And some kids might tell you, well, I'm mad, but in the yellow zone, I'm not irate. And don't get stuck on, well, mad's printed as a red zone emotion. If they have this justification and understanding for how these emotions are impacting them, then I want them to listen to their body and have this be something that makes sense for them and not be something that's just prescribed and not necessarily individualized to be the most relevant for the individual. So with that, some kids might tell you too, I'm bored, but I feel bored in the yellow zone. That's okay. It's stressful for some kids rather than being more withdrawn for other kids. And some kids will start telling you, I'm in the lime green zone. I'm kind of between yellow and green. That's fine too. So with that, one kid, a high schooler I was working with once, he checked into me and said that there is, what his day was struggling. And he goes, Miss Leah, I'm just in the brown zone today. I'm like, well, what's the brown zone? He goes, I'm just having a really shitty day. So I haven't included the brown zone, but it is, kind of like, real for some of us some days. And so I told him, I'm like, you know what, let's keep that between us. Let's not go home telling your parents that you're in the brown zone, but I hear you. And I've had those days too. So, okay. So in regards to assessment and data collection, there is not one all-encompassing assessment tool I have found that really captures these regulation skills, but it is combining different informal and standardized assessment tools to get a picture. Observation and interview are really powerful. On the website, under the resources tab, we have a whole link that there's student self-assessment and they can be self-monitoring. We have the self-regulation data collection, which is just a scale that you can give to someone familiar with the student to get a pre and post informal overview. And then there's these standardized measures, which I've listed here, and you might use a combination of those to dig in. Here's an example of the self-assessment pre and post. And then we have the CERTS model is one of the tools I find really valuable. So CERTS stands for Social Communication, Emotional Regulation, Transactional Supports. And it's a comprehensive educational approach for children with autism spectrum disorders. And what it does really nicely is breaks down regulation into the developmental stages and then the sub skills within that. So you can see where skills are emerging, and it also lends itself well to goal writing. I also have a appendices where I have some goals if that's of interest as well. So thinking about where to start, this is on page 18 and 19 in the book. Excuse me. I don't know too if you guys can hear, there's a thunderstorm rolling in. So if you're hearing the thunder rumbling or the rain on the roof, that's what's up. Or my lighting changing. So thinking about where to start, this is in the book, and I'm going to try to get out my pen here to help kind of annotate this. So chapter 3 is where the first lesson begins. Prior to that, chapters 1 and 2 are going to give you an overview, help you get started. It's about 25 pages, so I really encourage you to take that time to look at it, read through it. And there's things in there I don't discuss today. But then as we look at what chapter 3 aims to do, we're helping to build awareness of emotions. And first, we're looking at emotions in others and using the 4 zones to think about these feelings and categorize them. And then in lesson 4, we start thinking about how I might move through the different zones. And we start thinking about using the zones with ourselves. And from there, we just are building more awareness of understanding emotions and perspectives, the interoceptive piece of how I feel these feelings, how we move through the zones across the day, how things trigger me to move between the zones. And so I want to highlight here that there's this little jog. You will find there's a lot of room for your own judgment, your using your knowledge of what your students' needs are, what their abilities are. And you can take that and use it to guide you in how you're going to interact with the curriculum and setting up your scope and sequence. So there's nothing wrong with doing this sequentially, lesson after lesson in the order it's laid out. But you may find Nate is a kid you'll meet in some of my videos and stories here. He was a kid who came into my office as a 3rd grader, stared at the zones visuals on the wall for about 2 minutes, and he turned to me and bluntly said, "Well, I'm in the yellow zone. I'm feeling nervous. I've never met you before." And that was how I got to know Nate. So the zones made instant sense for him. And he had this very good awareness of what his feelings were. So we did this jog here. So if I can change my color here. So chapter 4 is about exploring tools. And we categorize them into sensory supports. We have calming techniques or kind of mind-body tools. And then we have thinking-based tools, or cognitive tools. And different kids will gravitate to different ones. So we explore these different tools. And once these kids are able to, in chapter or lesson 4 here, recognize how they're feeling and relate it to the zones, we can then start putting our tools into the zones. So this tool would be a good one for when I'm in the blue zone. I don't think it would work for the red zone so well. This tool makes a better red zone tool for me. And so they may come to you with tools that they've already are familiar with. You might have tools that you're familiar with, and you'll find a variety of tools that are taught and included in the curriculum. And so this is an opportunity for you to then explore these different tools and help kids figure out how these tools might help them manage these 4 different zones. Then chapter 5 is really about, let's see here, helping them now use these tools real time to regulate. So we're kind of putting it all together here. And this is now where we build our toolbox and we're practicing and role playing using tools and thinking about scenarios, how they unfold using tool versus not using a tool, how we can stop and have a different outcome if we use a tool, and celebrating our success. So with these tools, with the chapter 5, we're really helping them now work towards demonstrating that learning real time. And so I want to just highlight something that I see happen sometimes is some people might do a nice job putting up this visual of the zones, which is lesson 1. And very soon after, they're moving towards the expectation that these kids are going to stop and use a tool. And they've missed almost everything in between. And what happens in those scenarios is kids become very resistive. The zones suck. Zones are stupid. So understand this is a developmental process. It takes more than just putting up some visuals of the zones for many of these kids. It takes more than just using the language and modeling it. For many of these kids, it is digging in, it's teaching, it's giving them opportunities to practice. And so these lessons are there to help you with that and to guide you through that. The other thing I want to just highlight is you can pause at any time. Think about, you get to lesson 5 here, which is understanding different perspectives. And some kids, you might realize that just knocked their socks off. They had no idea people were thinking about them. Maybe you pause and put the zones on the back burner. You can still be using the visuals, referencing the language, creating this climate that it's part of your climate. However, maybe you dig into more of the social thinking materials or other resources to support that. And the pacing of the zones, again, it's going to be student driven. Don't feel like each week is a new lesson. Many of our kids in 18 weeks are not going to develop from behavior strategies to metacognitive strategies. It's going to take more time. And so you might spread lessons out over even one lesson over the course of a month and take 1 week for each color zone. You might use some of the additional learning activities that are suggested after the lessons to further give practice and opportunities for reflection. And think about too, some of these lessons we can do multiple times. My toolbox always is evolving as what I'm tapping into for strategies, especially these kids who are growing and maturing. Their tools change every year. The number of emotions up here in lesson 1 that we're associating with each zones will continue to grow with time as they build a bigger emotional vocabulary. Okay, so let me erase all this and okay, so thinking about setup, there is in the book, it's included in the back that you get this little USB drive, and I pulled mine out to show you. So on the back cover of the book, this little credit card looking deal is included. I saw one of the questions that came in was, what if I had an older book that had a CD? You can email info@socialthinking.com and they will get you that replacement and arrange that with you. But what this does, this little USB drive, you can pop this out and plug it into your computer, and you have all these printables and accessible to you. So I have created to help you set this up one page, just what is the zones information, so that you can give that to the teacher, the parent, maybe the bus driver. Then we have a glossary of zones language, and then just this refrigerator visual that we can be accessing and using to create a visual. Also with your setup, think about a binder or a folder for each kid to help them organize this, that we're going to keep the hard copies because we are going to keep coming back to these lessons and add to them, continue. Once we plant the seed, we're going to be monitoring it and really help grow these concepts for the individual. So that means holding on to these hard copies of the work we're doing. We can also be thinking about an interactive learning board. So there are lots of ways that this can look. So you need to take into account your population, the age, the abilities, the language demands, the accessibility of it. So I know another question I got was, how old do you start this with? I say about 4 and up. Now, some kids might be ready younger. My son, when he was about 3, he started using the zones word and told us one night he was in the blue. But my daughter, when she was 3, she would say, well, I'm in the black zone, because that was the color shirt she was wearing at the time. So it's very student driven. I do want to say some people see this colors, these illustrated feelings, and they say, well, how do I make this applicable for my middle school, high school, my secondary age population? And I want to share many of the lessons I wrote for my secondary age population that are included in the book. I saw a need with this population as they sat in these classrooms and were being regulated by aides in their classrooms, tapping them and being told, you need to take a break. And I got to thinking, in a year or two, the only break they're going to get on a work site is a lunch break. And if their employers need to give them a calming break and tell them so, there's absolutely no way they're going to be able to maintain employment. So I needed to think about, for my caseload, what is an easy way that they're going to be able to capture, build this awareness around how they're feeling. And so that's where I came up with these 4 colored zones that they could start self-monitoring, so that they could be catching themselves and not be dependent on the aid to indicate to them that what they needed. And from there, I just built more lessons and activities to help teach them. And much of that is in the book today. So then back to this, considering an interactive learning board, this is going to look different for different ages, different populations. So let me share with you on this, just different ways we can think about this. So right here, when we're starting, first of all, think about the height that you hang this. If you expect to bring kids over to use it, and I find it's an excellent way to co-regulate with kids, it needs to be at a height that they can see, touch, feel. And right here, I'm drawing a line. This is all you need to start. The 4 colors, it doesn't have to be in the shape of the traffic themes. Think about how many emotions you're going to start with. For, say, kindergartners, you might only pick 2 or 3 emotions per zone. Kids who are secondary age, you might have a wider variety. And you can continue to grow the number of feelings. So over here are additional feelings that we can keep adding to each of these zones. There's this Velcro here. And so we can grow our zones from what you originally maybe laminated or put together too. And then we have this check-in. We're going to talk about the check-in after lunch. So this is a way that kids can come over and indicate how they're feeling. Then maybe we start thinking about our tools. Maybe we have a tool of the week. Maybe it's size of the problem here. And as we learn a tool, we have a visual choice board of all of our different tools we've been practicing. And now, lastly, we add this I can try toolbar and put the whole sentence together. When I feel silly in the yellow zone, I can try maybe chair push-ups or something to that regard. And that's one of the tool choices. So one moment here. So getting started, I do start at lesson 1. We're thinking about becoming familiar with what these 4 zones entail. We're working to understand a basic set of emotions to represent these 4 zones. So we're working on an emotional vocabulary that meets the students where they're at without overwhelming them and making it too confusing. We can add to these emotions per zone as they gain understanding around it. We're also working to understand facial expressions and body language associated with these feelings. So much of co-regulation is based upon reading each other's body language, facial expressions, that nonverbal communication. And for example, a teacher gives you kind of a downward scowling glance. He's indicating he may not be pleased with you right now. And if you can read that facial expression, you can regulate it around it. I'm sure I speak for many of you. You may know someone who doesn't wear a lot of facial expressions. And I would bet that some of you are more uncomfortable around that person because you can't read how they're perceiving you. You know, am I talking too much? Did I say something that offended them? Do they want me to leave? I'm not sure. And when they're not giving those affirmative head nods and this social smile, the eye gaze, it can be a lot more challenging to co-regulate around each other. So we're integrating this in to the learning that we're doing around the zones. So these guys here, they're creating their zones posters, their traffic signs, and playing a game of charades to do that. So that charades might look something like this.
You are scared. You are trying to get away from people. You are.
What's he feeling?
You are not tired. You're cold.
Shy.
You're sad.
Are you shy?
Are you sad?
Different clue one, Miguel? You can use words too.
Overwhelmed? Scared? Excited?
It's my turn to video.
Then my turn.
Let's think about Sean.
Distracted? Tired?
Squirmy? Wiggly?
Funny?
Seems like he's having a hard time finding a spot.
Distracted.
No, good facial expressions. I think I know what it is, Sean.
What is it?
Can you say something that would help describe the way you're feeling right now?
I don't like this chair. Too uncomfortable. Yes.
Nice work. Oh, hey, Nate, your eyes aren't thinking about Sean.
Uncomfortable.
Okay, so here is some different elementary age groups. These kids had already had exposure to the zones, and we were going back and revisiting lesson 1, expanding the number of emotions per zone that they were associating with it. So again, it's not necessarily one and done with these lessons. We can keep revisiting them. Oops. Here's a way. I know there's several questions coming in for how do you do this with secondary age kids? What does it look like? So I want you to be open-minded about, we have a framework for thinking about these 4 zones, and that can be adapted, tweaked, modified in so many ways to really speak to your population. So here's paint strips with emotions written on them that correlate to each of the 4 zones. Here is a collage with teens, tweens, adults expressing feelings. And this is harder because these pictures aren't labeled. This is one, I did with a group of 9th grade kids. And it was part of the learning was trying to come up with the vocabulary word to label that expression, that emotion that she's feeling. And so it's, again, just another way to create the same representation, the same system. This specific collage you see here on the screen is accessible for all these Google Pics on the zones of regulation and action. And if you scroll through the chat on the Facebook group, many people have had discussions already about using this with secondary age kids and sharing a lot of ideas and insights of what has worked for them. This picture here too also highlights how this became first a visual to represent the 4 zones, and then they added to it and expanded upon it, adding in the different ways to help support the regulation of the 4 zones on the bottom. Here is a poster, and this is an easy way. You can create this on your own or hang this up. And this is something maybe I put in a regular ed classroom. And we don't talk about the bottom and the tools at first. Think about just the top of this. And maybe I read a book with the kids in the class and say, we're going to think about all the different ways we feel. And we're going to use these 4 color zones to help us categorize these different feelings. The blue zone representing this, this, and that, and green, and so forth. And that is all in the zones curriculum. You can see the dialogue that you might use and work from printed in there. And then there's maybe children's literature you use next. Let's read this book and see if we can figure out how these characters are feeling and what zone they would be in. And then you can be using connections to the literature. Tell me about a time you felt that way. Show me how, angry looks on your face. What zone do you think lonely would go in or whatnot? So here's some different books that explore feelings. The top ones work well for your your early childhood kiddos, your kindergartners. The bottom 2 work better for your more mid-elementary age kids with more complex feelings, more mature scenarios. And then the way I feel in the book, I just find has a lot of versatility, and all the emotions in that book are also printed in the zones with the different emotions you can print off and categorize. So it is 11:45. We're gonna, here in Wisconsin, we are going to take an hour for lunch. I am going to leave you with this fun little song my friend wrote called What Zone Are You In? And it's a part of a bigger collection of music. But this is a nice way to incorporate kinesthetic learning into our teaching around the zones as well as the musicality. So I will leave you with that. We will be back in an hour, okay? Enjoy your lunch.
What zone are you in? What zone are you in? How your body feels and what your face shows tells us the zone you're in. When you're in the blue zone, your body moves so slow. You can feel sad, sick or tired. Jump in!